Yes, Miss Grange. No.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Who's the next witness?
Yes, it's Mr. Daniel Anketell-Jones.
Good, thank you.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Anketell-Jones. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. Now, we shall have a break roughly halfway through the afternoon, but if at any stage you feel you need to have an additional break, will you just tell me? All right? Thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Anketell-Jones. Thank you very much for attending today to give evidence. It's very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty understanding anything I'm asking you in the course of your evidence, please ask me to repeat the question or put the point in a different way. And if you feel you need a break at any point, please let us know. And can you please try and keep your voice up so that the transcriber lady there to your right can take down a good note of what you're saying. Now, you've made two statements to the inquiry. I want to take you to them. They're in a folder on your desk in front of you, and they'll appear on the screen. The first is dated the 8th of November 2018, and it's to be found at HAR 30-10149. And if we can look on at page 18 of that statement, is that your signature there at the bottom?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And have you read that statement recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm that the contents are true?
Yes.
And now the second statement to the inquiry was made on the 19th of March 2019. If we pull that up, that's at HAR 30-10513. And if you can go to page 2 of that, again, is that your signature at the bottom of that statement?
Yes.
And have you read that recently?
No.
Can you confirm the contents are true? That's the short statement that you deal with the deletion of certain items from your laptop computer.
Yes, it's true.
Thank you. And you also made a statement to the Metropolitan Police Service dated the 9th of December 2019. If we can pull that up, that's at MET 30-64867. That's a very short statement, just 2 pages, and that's in the final tab on your desk. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes.
Thank you. And have you discussed your statements or evidence with anybody before coming here today?
No.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to start by considering your background and your qualifications. If we look at paragraph 4 of your main statement, this is HAR 30-10149. And if we zoom in on paragraph 4, you tell us there in the first sentence that you graduated from the University of Sussex in 2003 with a BEng in electrical and mechanical engineering, robotics and automated manufacture. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And you go on within that paragraph to explain that after finishing that degree, you initially worked with a company called Bespoke Design Services. Is that correct?
Yes.
What kind of work did that company do?
Curtain wall design.
Curtain wall design. And cladding design or just curtain wall?
Curtain wall and windows from memory.
Right. And how big was that company?
Initially, there was 2 people, and I think at its largest point, it was probably 5.
Yeah. And is it right that the founder of that company and your boss at the time was Mr. Kevin Lamb? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you know him before you worked at Bespoke Design Services?
No.
And what was your initial role title when you worked for that company?
I think it was project designer, as it says there.
Yeah. And can you help us as to what that involved in practice?
So you would take the design by the architect and take the system details and put them together into a way that could be then manufactured. So it was mainly to do with producing fabrication drawings for the factory.
And just to be clear, that was for windows and curtain walling, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So did your role involve designing facades?
No, it was designing fabricated components.
And you say at paragraph 4 of your witness statement that you were quickly promoted to the position of project designer. Roughly how long before you were promoted? Can you recall?
No, I can't. I think it's when the company grew in size a bit.
Yeah. And was it Mr. Kevin Lamb who promoted you?
Yes.
Yeah. And did you undertake any formal design training or qualifications in order to undertake your role as project designer for that company?
I think I went to one of the curtain wall companies for a few training courses, which was Schuko.
Schuko. Yeah. And about roughly how much time did you spend on those training courses? Can you remember?
I think it equated to a couple of days.
Yeah. And what type of projects did you work on? Was there a theme in terms of the type of projects that you...
No, it was a design. It was sort of a design outsourcing company, so it was just different facade companies would come to them to, draw up the sort of fabrication drawings.
Yeah. And in that role as project designer, were you required to consider the fire performance of materials?
No.
Now, looking again at paragraph 4 of your statement, at the end there, you say you then moved from bespoke design services to Balstead International Heaters Limited. Was that in around 2006?
Yeah, I would have thought so.
Yeah. And what did your role in that organisation entail?
That was as working as a project engineer for, basically they did oil heaters for the oil refinery. So the role involved working to sort of put together the fabrication components to get them sent out to where they were going to be installed.
So am I right that was nothing to do with the design of cladding or curtain walling or any external facades?
No, it wasn't.
No. And you explain in paragraphs 4 and 5 of your statement that you've been working there for about 6 months before moving to Harley Curtain Wall in November 2006. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, what role were you initially employed in for Harley?
I think it was project engineer.
And what were your general duties as project engineer?
It's the same thing as when I was working at Bespoke Design. It was taking the architect's drawings and putting them into system drawings that could then be fabricated.
Were you designing facades for Harley at any stage?
No, I was designing fabricated components.
I see. So you're drawing that distinction between being the designer of the facade and being the person who's designing the fabricated components. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you receive any formal training from Harley in respect of that role?
Very towards the end of my time with Harley, I started an MSc in facade engineering with them.
Yes, I'm going to come to that in a moment. So had you obtained any qualifications when you initially started working for Harley to assist you in your design of fabrication designs?
No, the other thing I did was an MSc in structural engineering, because the structural engineering at that time was subbed out to a structural engineering firm. There were issues with communicating what you needed from them, so they decided having a structural engineer in-house would make that part easier.
Yeah. When were you promoted to the role of design manager in Harley?
I can't remember. It would probably be on my CV.
Was it before the Grenfell project, or do you think during it?
It'd be before that.
A long time before, or?
I can't remember.
You can't remember. So, as you've just mentioned, in paragraph 7 of your statement, if we go to that on page 2 of this document, you say that whilst working for Harley, you obtained the MSc in structural engineering from the University of Surrey, and you started an MSc in facade engineering from the University of Bath between 2014 and 2017. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, what did your MSc in facade engineering involve?
It involved attending the University of Bath for a week at a time and studying particular topics.
Yeah. Did it include looking at the design of facades?
Yes.
Did it include any teaching about the fire performance of facades?
Yes, but not until I'd left Harley.
Is it right that the MSc includes one optional module on acoustics and fire?
That's correct.
Yeah. And did you take that module?
Yeah, I took that after I'd left Harley Custom.
And was there any other teaching on the course about fire performance or the testing and classification of facade materials more generally?
Not that I can remember.
So is it right that until you did that module of that course, you hadn't had any academic training in terms of fire performance?
No.
And did the course include anything on the requirements under the building regulations 2010?
There were different parts of the course that covered different parts of the building regulations.
Yeah.
So parts of them did. So, for example, there was a thermal course that would have covered Part L.
Yeah.
And for the fire course, it would have covered Part B.
I see. So it wasn't until you did the fire module on acoustics and fire that you would have looked at Part B. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Anketell-Jones. It's very natural to nod or shake your head, but unfortunately it doesn't go on the transcript too well.
Sorry.
So if you could please try and remember to say yes or no as well.
Yes, sir.
Yes? Thank you.
Yes, so I think you just confirmed that it wasn't until you did the fire module on acoustics and fire that you would have looked at Part B of the building regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Ray Bailey last week in his evidence said that you were about 3/4 of the way through this MSc in facade engineering at the time of your work on the Grenfell project. Is that correct?
No, it's incorrect. I didn't start until the end of 2014.
So if you were to estimate how far through you were that course during the time you worked on the Grenfell project, what would you say?
Probably done one module, so probably, I think the last module counts as 2, so I'm probably about a 12th of the way through.
Yeah. Now, were you aware when you undertook that course that the Department of Architecture and Civil Engineering at Bath University works closely with the Centre of Window Cladding and Technology, the CWCT, to provide an industry-relevant course on facade engineering?
Yes, I was.
When did you first become aware of the CWCT as an industry organisation?
I think when we started discussing taking the MSc on, so probably earlier that year.
Yeah. So does that mean earlier in 2014?
Yeah.
Yeah. At the time you worked on the Grenfell project, would you have said that you were well placed within Harley to advise on whether particular materials complied with the building regulations?
Only of a structural nature.
So you were only able to advise on whether the structural performance of those materials was adequate under the building regulations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what about the guidance in approved document B? How familiar were you with that at the time of the Grenfell project?
Not very at all.
Did Harley provide you with any training or ongoing continual professional development to assist you in your role as design manager?
The role as design manager was to manage the programme of others, so there wasn't much training that could be given for that, but for the structural part.
So is the answer to my question no, that you weren't provided with ongoing professional development by Harley?
No.
Now, I just want to look briefly now at an email that we're going to come back to later and look at in much more detail, but I want to go to it now. This is at CEL 6019, and I want to look at page 2. So going down that page, I want to look at the email you send there, that's it, on the 16th of January 2015 at 11:27. Can you just quickly familiarise yourself with that email in terms of what you say there? This is an email from you to Jonathan Room at Celotex.
Yep.
So you're saying there in the second line, we're being asked by one of our clients to see the test results and certificates for the RS 5000 insulation. And then you're asking various questions about the BS 8414 Part 2 2005 testing in the next paragraph. And then you're also asking about the BS 476 Part 7 testing in the next paragraph. Now, as I say, I'm going to come back and ask you a lot more detailed questions later about this, but I just want to ask you, do you agree that it's evident from this that you are familiar with BS 8414 testing, including the results of that testing?
No, because this would have been that I had been asked for something specific by one of the clients. I was just basically passing it through, requesting the same information to send it back.
I see. So is what you're saying that you have received a request from a client and the information you're asking for here and the detail you've got in this email is just you simply passing that on to Celotex?
Yeah, just passing on their specific request.
So the same question about the BS 476 Part 7 testing that you deal with in the third paragraph there. Were you familiar with that kind of testing at the time you wrote that email?
No, I wasn't.
Did you know at the time you wrote it what BS 476 Part 7 testing was relevant to when it comes to the classification of materials?
I knew it was relevant to fire testing, that was all.
That was it, was it? You didn't know anything more about it?
No.
Do you know what classification you might have achieved if you'd successfully undertaken that test and other tests?
Not at that stage, no.
Were you familiar with a document called BR 135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, produced by the British Research Establishment? Were you familiar with that publication?
I'd heard it mentioned, and people had talked about it in support of using certain facades, but it was always something I passed through to the clients.
So had you read that publication at the time of the Grenfell project?
No.
So you hadn't received any formal training, or indeed informal training, about the testing and classification regimes in the UK at this time?
No.
Did Harley provide you with any formal or informal training to keep you up to date with the building regulations?
No.
Or what about something called Approved Document B on fire safety?
No.
Had you read Approved Document B at the time of the
No.
Grenfell project?
My role was as a structural engineer and a design manager, so didn't have any requirement to.
Were you or Harley, at the time of the Grenfell project, a member of any industry bodies relevant to facade design?
No. Harley may have been. I think, yeah, Harley were a member of the CWCT.
Were you aware of that at the time of the Grenfell project, that Harley were a member of the CWCT?
I can't remember.
You can't remember?
No.
And what about you personally? Were you ever personally a member of the CWCT?
No.
Do you recall attending CWCT members' meetings?
I remember going to a talk in London or something like that, but I can't remember what it was on, or if it was CWCT or not.
Okay. What about any other industry or trade associations to do with facades or external walls?
No.
You don't remember Harley or yourself being a member of any?
No.
At the time, did you think it was necessary for a specialist cladding contractor to engage with trade associations to keep up to date with relevant knowledge and industry developments?
It wasn't something that I thought of. It was something for them senior management to make those decisions.
Yeah. And they never suggested that you should keep up with those type of industry bodies or publications?
No, I kept up to date with my structural CPD.
Yeah.
But that was where my feeling of responsibility for my CPD stopped.
Was that something you did off your own back, on your own, or was that
Yeah.
something you were encouraged to do by senior leaders at Harley?
It was something I did on my own out of the feeling of needing to progress and keep up with current legislation.
Yeah. Now, in terms of your role on the Grenfell project, if we go back to your statement on page 2, that's HAR 30010149 at page 2, and we look at paragraph 9. So you say there in the first sentence that you were involved in the refurbishment project for Grenfell Tower over a period of about a year in the capacity of design manager. Do you see that there?
Yes,
And I think you told us earlier that you were promoted to the role of design manager before you worked on the Grenfell project. Is that right?
yes,
So you had acted as design manager for other major projects for Harley?
yes.
In his evidence last week, Mr. Ray Bailey indicated that at the time of the Grenfell project, you were the technical manager and that your job was to assess the technical compliance of products. That was at day 32, page 17, line 21. Do you agree with that? Were you the technical manager?
No, I don't. I don't think I was made a technical manager until, I don't know, end of 2015, beginning of 2016 perhaps, because I hadn't had any training in that area yet.
So there was a distinction, was there, within Harley between the role of design manager, which you say you did perform, and the role of technical manager, which you say you didn't perform till later. Is that correct?
That's correct.
As design manager, was your job, or part of your job, to assess the technical compliance of products?
No,
Whose role was that within Harley, under your understanding?
prior to the previous technical manager leaving, it would have been him after he left. I'm not sure who that fell on.
And who was that when you're talking about him leaving?
That would have been Graham Hackley.
Graham Hackley. And when a technical manager was appointed after his departure, who was that?
There wasn't one appointed until I'd done enough of the degree to sort of start moving into that role.
I see. So that was the factor, was it, that meant you ended up as technical manager, having done enough of that facade engineering degree?
Back then, the commercial manager was struggling to win work because there wasn't enough technical support. So he was keen for me to move over to that role and help at the front end of the business.
And when you were the technical manager at Harley, did you understand it to be part of your job to assess the technical compliance of products?
Not at that point because I wasn't qualified yet.
So at what point did you think you were?
It would have been when I would have qualified to have been able to, cast opinions across the full range of performance requirements.
And did you ever get to that stage while you worked for Harley?
No.
No. Now, at paragraph 6 of your witness statement on page 2, you say there in the first line, what was involved in the role of design manager depended on a particular project and who else was on the team. And then you say, but on the whole, it included being the designer on individual projects, as well as ensuring that other projects had sufficient design resource, a designer, and that they kept to the building works programme. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So can you just describe for us in a little bit more detail what your role as a design manager generally used to entail?
Well, usually I'd have a couple of projects myself that I'd actually be working on and drawing the fabrication drawings for. And then there would be a couple of designers in the office, and it would be my responsibility to make sure that they were keeping up with their demands of work making sure they were keeping the project managers happy on site, and maybe moving design resource around if a particular project was running behind.
Yeah. Now, you also say in that last sentence of paragraph 6, this sometimes involved appointing external subcontractor designers, as was the case with Grenfell. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And is an example of that the appointment of Kevin Lamb as the external subcontract designer for the Grenfell Tower project?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we'll come back to his specific role later, but can you explain in general who was it at Harley that would determine whether an external subcontractor would be required?
I think it was just known that there wasn't enough design resource, and I think because, do you mean in general or specifically for Grenfell?
Who would take that decision on a project? Who would be the person to say, we need an external subcontract designer on this project? Would that be you, or would that be someone else in Harley?
I think I'd probably feed back that there wasn't enough resource.
Yeah.
And then they could either make the decision to bring in someone external or to employ more people.
Yeah. And what process would Harley normally go through to appoint an external subcontract designer? Can you help us on that?
I think in the past, before Kevin, we'd used a couple of companies, and usually it was word of mouth of other companies stating whether they were good or not.
Would Harley take any steps to ensure that these external subcontract designers were competent to undertake the role?
Not that I'm aware of.
So you're not aware of any steps
No,
being
it
taken?
would just be you'd probably seek other people's feedback.
So would references be taken from professionals involved in other projects about their competence?
Yeah, but it would be not in an official way. It'd be that you'd call up people that they'd work with and get feedback that way.
And we'll come back to Kevin Lamb later, but can you recall that happening with Kevin Lamb's appointment?
I think that Harley had worked with Kevin before, and I don't think anyone raised any issues with working with him again.
Yeah. Now, if we can go to paragraph 14 of your witness statement, this is at the bottom of page 3 and on to page 4. You say there, as the design manager for the Grenfell project, my involvement included managing the project designer's work, managing the flow of information between the relevant project contractors or individuals, and helping to ensure that we were keeping to the building works programme and dealing with any issues that arose. Because of my involvement in other projects, I would often be dipping in and out of the Grenfell project. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, you say there that one of your roles was to manage the project designer's work. Who was that on the Grenfell project?
It'd be Kevin Lamb.
Yeah. And given what you say there in that paragraph, does that mean that you were not involved yourself in carrying out the day-to-day design of the facade on the Grenfell project?
As far as I can remember, that's correct. All I did from a design point of view was the structural design.
Right, yeah. And who was it that was doing the facade design then, in terms of
Again,
other aspects, not just structural?
Again, it's Kevin would be taking the architect's drawings and turning them into fabrication drawings.
Can you explain what your role involved in terms of managing the project designer's work? What would that involve?
So at the beginning, there wasn't a project manager or a contracts manager involved. So it was to try and get the design program to meet the project program and try and scope out what period he'd need for design, what period would be needed for approvals from the client's team, and then any revisions that he needed to do so that it could meet the fabrication requirements.
So it's scoping out periods he would need for design. Is that periods of time he would need for design?
It'd be basically trying to program the works.
Yeah.
So, for example, you'd kind of look at the building, work out how many drawings you thought you'd need, and then try and roughly work out how long that would take
Yeah,
to do,
yeah,
and make sure that he was keeping to that.
yeah. Did your role involve actually supervising the design work that was being done by the project designer on the project?
Supervising it in the sense of the programme, yes.
But just limited to that, was it? Only the programme?
Yeah.
So you weren't looking at the adequacy of the project designer's work in any other way?
No, I'd pass those on to people in the company who were, well, from a structural point of view I would, but from the any other points of view I'd pass them on to other people in the company.
So who would you have been passing other aspects of the design on to within the company?
People with more experience, like Mark Stapley or Ray Bailey.
I see. So in terms of supervising the extent to which the design was compliant with the building regulations and associated guidance, did you see that as part of your role?
No.
And was that made expressly clear to you when you worked at Harley, or was that something that you just assumed?
I think with the amount of work I had on other projects, I couldn't look at the designer's work. I can't remember having a contract that said that it was or wasn't involved.
And in terms of the supervision of the extent to which the design was compliant with the building regulations, who else within Harley did you think was responsible for that?
I would have thought Mark Stapley and Ray Bailey.
And does that mean Mark Stapley and Ray Bailey were frequently sent the work of Kevin Lamb to check it for compliance?
I think so.
You think so?
Yeah, I can remember passing drawings on that Kevin had sent in to see if they were what they wanted.
I see. Now, you say at paragraph 9 of your witness statement that you were involved in the Grenfell project for a period of about a year in that capacity as design manager. This was between June 2014 and May 2015, is that correct?
Yeah, roughly. I think because I'd started to help out a lot with the estimating at that point. I was probably moving away from it quite a lot from early 2015.
Yeah. What about before June 2014? Did you have any involvement in the project prior to that?
I can't remember, but I don't believe I did.
Yeah. And you go on to say at paragraph 9, this is in the 5th line, at the same time as being involved with the Grenfell project, I was also working as designer on 2 other Harley projects, Trinity Square between February 13 and October 15, and Compass House between October 15 and March 16, as well as managing the design resource on other projects. And then you say, from my recollection, most of my time was taken up designing these 2 other projects. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, just pausing there, that last sentence, most of my time was taken up designing these 2 other projects. What do you mean by designing? Do you mean just structural design, or do you mean
Be drawing
broader design?
Order design, drawing the fabricated components to be ordered.
Sorry, I said broader design. I think you then said order design, did you?
Drawing the fabricated components for ordering.
I see. So that's what you were doing on those 2 other projects?
Yeah.
Ordering fabricated components?
By drawing fabricated components so they could be ordered.
I see. And you've said that most of your time was taken up on these 2 other projects, and you say something similar at paragraph 14, last sentence on page 4. You say, because of my involvement in other projects, I would often be dipping in and out of the Grenfell project. We looked at that earlier. So is it right that your time was divided between the design work on several different projects during your time at Harley?
Yes, it was split between doing actual work on those 2 other projects and then ensuring that Kevin was keeping to the programme on the 3rd project.
I see, yeah. Were you working on any other projects at this time, other than those other 2 you've mentioned?
I would have been doing structural calculations on all the projects going through at that time.
Yeah. What proportion of your time would you estimate you were spending on the Grenfell project during that time? So you said between June 14 and May 15.
5% perhaps.
So very little of your time.
Yes.
Were you very stretched at the time in terms of the work you were having to do for Harley?
I think I was, for the majority of this, I was almost entirely focused on Trinity Square because it was a project that had a lot of problems and we'd had a high staff turnover. I'd even for a while been solely based on that site without being in the office at all.
Would it be fair to say that your time was limited when you were monitoring and supervising the progress of the Grenfell refurbishment project?
Yeah, I was focused on Trinity Square.
Yeah. Now, just a few questions about the deleted emails. You've dealt with this topic in your second witness statement. Can we just turn to this? This is HAR 30/10513. And at paragraph 3 on the first page, in the first two sentences, you explain there that you left the employment of Harley Facades Limited in March 2016. And prior to leaving, it was agreed with the managing director, Ray Bailey, that I could keep my work laptop. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And you go on to say, to ensure I did not retain any Harley information, it was agreed that I would delete it all from the laptop. This included, for example, access to the server, all Harley emails, documents, and design drawings. Do you see that there? And then you go on to say, accordingly, on my last day of employment at the end of March 2016, I deleted any and all Harley information. Do you see that there?
Yes.
As a professional, were you aware that it might be important to retain records of your work?
Yeah, but that's why I believe everything would be kept on the company server because all the laptops just attached into the server.
I see.
And all the emails were retained on there.
So it was on that basis that you thought that the information would be preserved in case it was required in the future. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you say at the end of the paragraph 3, you say you believed at the time that whilst Harley's information would be wiped from the laptop, it would be retained on the company's server. You see that there?
Yes.
And you've just mentioned that in your evidence. Did you yourself check that before deleting the information, or was that an assumption you made?
Yeah, it was an assumption I'd made from the system that had been set up.
Can we just have a look at Mr. Ray Bailey's witness statement at this point? This is HAR 30/10184 at page 21. And I want to look at paragraph 83. Now, in the very bottom 3 lines of that page, actually, let's pick it up at the 4th from bottom line. It says, as for Daniel Anketell-Jones, he left Harley some months before the fire. By that stage, he had both deleted all of his Harley-related emails from his laptop and had arranged with our service provider to remove his email file from our systems. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I just want to ask you what was meant, or what you think he might have meant by that last part, had arranged with our service provider to remove his email file from our systems. Can you help us as to what he's referring to there?
I never contacted the service provider to remove the email from the systems, so I don't know what he means by that.
Right, I see. Because my question was going to be, if you had arranged to remove your files from Harley's systems, how could you have assumed that that information would remain on the server? You know, you understand the point.
Yes, I understand the point,
But you didn't arrange.
I didn't arrange for that to happen.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have had the authority or the security to do that.
So as far as you were concerned, the information would have stayed on Harley's server, and any emails, drawings or documents which you sent or received in relation to the project would have been recovered that way. Is that correct?
Yes, because in the past where I'd had a laptop break or I'd replaced the laptop. It was just a simple case of connecting it back up to the server and you had all of your emails instantly once again.
I see. Are you aware of any information simply having been lost? Is there any information that you can recall but you haven't seen in any Harley emails since?
Not that stands out. It was a long time ago.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I now want to just look at some of the previous projects you were involved in and turn to your CV first. Now, this is a CV which was provided by Ryden as part of their tender for the Grenfell Tower project. And if we can pull this up at ART 402087 at page 44. And we can see here, this is a page that relates to you, CV details, Daniel Anketell-Jones, and then there's a profile under this. Can you recall ever seeing this CV before it was submitted by Ryden?
No, I've never seen this document before.
Now, if we look at the main paragraph under profile, it says this: Daniel originally trained as a draftsman. Daniel has worked on a number of similar projects to Grenfell Tower whilst with Harley. Daniel has been selected for this project due to his experience with tower block refurbishment schemes. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, it says there that you originally trained as a draftsman. Is that correct?
Yes.
When was that? When did you train as a draftsman?
By train, I think, is a loose term that basically I've worked with Kevin Lamb at his company, drawing up details. When I first joined, it was drawing up the details as he told me to draw them.
Would you ever put in your own CV that you trained as a draftsman?
I don't think there's any reason why not to. I haven't.
But you don't think it's inaccurate?
No.
No. Okay. And then it says in the last line that you were selected due to your experience with tower block refurbishment schemes. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then on the right, under the heading benefits to the project, it says here, Daniel will provide the following specialist skill set. And we've got spec analysis, engineering, design detailing, budgetary control, design liaison. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Are they all accurate?
No.
Which ones do you not agree with?
Spec analysis, budgetary control.
Can you help us as to how those items might have appeared in this CV that was put forward by Ryden?
I can't. This was produced without my knowledge or consent.
Yeah. And then we can see 4 previous projects that are referred to under relevant project experience. We've got the Chalcots Estate project in Camden, the Ferrier Point in Newham, the Waits living space in Little Venice, and the Buxton Group Castlemaine Tower of Wandsworth. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you involved in all of those projects for Harley?
No.
Which ones were you not involved in?
I wasn't involved in the Chalcot Estate job. That was being worked on when I first joined the company, and it was the Little Venice was the first job I worked on, and then I wasn't involved with the Castlemaine Tower, I don't believe. Can't even remember that one.
Ferrier Point, were you involved in that one?
I was involved with Ferrier.
Yeah, I see. So you weren't involved in the Chalcots Estate project?
No.
Did you work as design manager on the Ferrier Point project?
I was responsible for detailing the fabrication details for that project. I can't remember what my title was at that point.
Okay. Now we can see Ferrier Point, it involved the window replacement and overcladding 23 stories. That's what's said here. And you've just told us you were detailing the fabrication drawings. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Who at Harley had design responsibility for the design of the facade in relation to those works?
Would have been the people overseeing that, which again would have been my line manager Mark Stapley and Ray Bailey.
And who from Ryden did you work with on that project? Do you remember any particular individuals that you worked with?
No.
I was going to ask you about the Chalcots Estate project, but just to be clear, you didn't have any role on that project, is that right?
I didn't have any role on that project.
Did you know what the materials were that were used on the Chalcots project for the facade?
I couldn't recount them. I know that they'd had some issues with delaminated panels that came from one supplier and they had to replace them with panels from another supplier, but that was all I knew.
So did you know what manufacturers had been involved in terms of the cladding, the rain screen cladding and the insulation on that project?
No.
Did you know that it was a rock wool insulation that was used?
No.
And you didn't know that it was Rainabond panels?
No.
Were you aware that a fire had occurred in a flat on the 17th floor of Taplow House on the night of the 16th of January 2012?
I can't discern whether I knew that then or whether I know it now, I'm afraid.
Okay, so you can't remember knowing that at the time?
No.
If we turn, can we look at Harley's inspection report? This is at HAR 40010169. We can see that this was written just very shortly after the fire. It says the date of the incident was on Sunday the 16th or Monday the 17th of January 2012, and the date of this report is the 17th of January 2012. Do you see that towards the top?
Yes.
And then we've got various names here. We can see it's written by Tim Lovell. We see that 19 up from the bottom of that section.
Yes.
And we can see that you are also part of the distribution for this report. Do you see your name there at the bottom of that list under distribution?
Yes.
Can you recall receiving this report about the fire at Taplow House?
No, I can't.
Do you think you were sent it and just have not remembered?
Because I wasn't involved with the project, I may have been sent it and not looked at it because I wasn't involved.
So you have no memory of ever reading the report, this report into the fire?
No, not until I've seen it recently.
If we turn to page 4 of this document, the author in the middle of this page, I want to look at the paragraph below this photograph. It says there, it was evident that despite the fire and the amount of flammable items in the flat, such as paper, etc., the fire breaks were still intact and prevented the fire spreading between flats. The Harley designed fire break system is visible. Now the surrounding fabric has melted under the extensive heat. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you recall ever reading that or anything similar
No.
about this fire? Were you aware that the Harley designed fire break system was still intact and had prevented the fire spreading between flats?
I can remember people saying about how the fire hadn't spread, but I wasn't aware of why it hadn't spread.
I see. So you were never told anything about the configuration of either fire stopping or cavity barriers in that facade that
No.
was relevant to that fire?
No.
Now, this report referred to the fact that a further survey would be carried out, and we have that further survey report. It was done by Abseil. If we can turn to that, this is at CEP 503223. So this is a further report that was recommended after that initial inspection. Do you recall seeing this report at the time you worked for Harley?
No, I don't believe I did.
Now we can see on page 2 of this that it is dated. We see the date of report 5 lines down. It's 23rd of January 2012. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And again, you're there on the distribution list. You're the last name on that distribution together with Mark Stapley and Graham Hackley of Harley. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I want to look at what's said at the bottom of page 2. If we can look at the paragraph at the bottom of that page, in the second sentence, if we pick it up, it says the severity of the fire completely destroyed the living room window. However, the fire was contained from spreading to over floors by the extensive fire breaks located at the head and sill of each window. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, do you remember ever reading that or anything similar while you were at Harley?
No, I think as before, because I wasn't involved in the project, either I didn't receive it or didn't read it.
So you don't recall being aware that fire breaks at both the head of the window and the sill of the window had played a role in terms of preventing fire spread?
No.
Do you recall anybody discussing the importance of cavity barriers or fire stopping around windows after this fire within Harley?
No.
Do you recall anyone discussing the maintenance of compartmentation after this fire and what was necessary to maintain compartmentation in flats?
No.
Okay. So, is it right that from your point of view, when Harley was designing the facade at Grenfell Tower, is it right that no consideration was given to the Taplow House fire and what had been learnt from that fire?
Yeah, I didn't know about it, so I didn't feed it through. I don't think anyone else fed it through.
And would Kevin Lamb have been aware of this, as far as you were aware?
Not as far as I was aware, no.
Yeah, well, we can ask him later this week. Were you aware that Harley had used ACM cladding on high-rise buildings prior to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes.
Grenfell Tower project. So you were aware that they'd used ACM?
Yes.
And were you aware of that from your work on the Ferrier Point?
And the Little Venice project.
Yeah. Did you make any assumptions about how safe the Rainabond cladding was because it had been used on previous projects?
I don't think I made any assumptions.
You didn't make any assumptions at all?
No.
About fire performance?
No. My role was as a structural engineer, so it wasn't within my remit.
Were you aware that Harley had used rock wool as an insulation product on previous high-rise projects?
Yes.
And did you ever apply your mind to the fire performance of rock wool insulation prior to the Grenfell Tower project?
No. Generally, if it was... I think the only time that I would ever consider the fire performance was if it was a performance specification and we'd been given a U value rather than a product. Then if the product that we came up with to hit the U value, then those questions would be asked and it would be sent off to the project's fire consultant to consider whether that was usable. But it was always something that I put back up the chain because I didn't know about fire at that point in my career.
I see. So just to summarise, are you saying that the only performance aspect you were ever looking at in terms of these projects was the thermal performance?
No, there's prescriptive specifications where all the products are specified.
Yeah.
You know, the exact product thickness, and then there's performance specifications where they will say that they want it to be a certain U value, a certain fire rating, and you have to then go out into the market and find products that hit that.
Yeah.
When you find a product, you then put it back to the team to be approved.
I see.
So if it was prescriptive, you'd follow what they had already set because it would have gone through the design process of being checked by all the consultants.
And if it was a fire performance that you had to hit, are you saying it wasn't any part of your role to check that a particular product didn't meet that fire performance?
If the specification had had a fire performance written in it, then we would try and find that fire performance.
Yeah. But would you always seek external advice on that?
Yes.
I see. Okay. Mr. Verler for Arconic has given evidence that he had certain conversations with representatives of Ryden during the Chalcott's estate project. Do you recall ever meeting a Mr. Verler of Arconic?
I've never heard of Mr. Verler.
No. And were you ever on site during the Chalcott's project? I think you've told us you weren't involved. Is that correct?
No, I wasn't involved. I
So
think I drove past it once with Tim Lovell, who pointed at it and said that was the project, but that was it.
Did you ever hear anybody else within Harley discussing meeting a representative of Arconic on the Chalcott's project?
No.
Now, I want to consider in a little bit more detail your understanding of the regulatory requirements at the time of the Grenfell project. Were you familiar yourself with the requirements of the Building Regulations 2010 when you were working on the Grenfell project?
No, I would have been mainly focused on the Euro codes for structural engineering.
The Euro codes for structural engineering, yeah. Were you aware that there was a thing called the Building Regulations that had
Yes,
to be
I was.
complied with? You were aware of that? Were you aware that the Building Regulations contained functional requirements that had to be met?
As far as structural engineering, I would have been aware of it because the Euro codes are designed to satisfy those
Right.
functional requirements.
Yeah. Were you aware that there were functional requirements in terms of fire performance?
I would have been able to logically deduce it, but that there were functional requirements for all part of the building.
Were you aware that there was a Part B in Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations that was relating to fire safety?
Yes, I was aware of it.
And were you aware that Part B divided down into Parts B1 through to B5?
No, I wasn't.
So had you heard of the B4 functional requirement in terms of a wall adequately resisting the spread of fire?
Not at that time, no.
Can we just look at approved document B? This is at CLG 50224. This is the 2013 edition of approved document B on fire safety. Now, I think before you said you weren't familiar with approved document B at the time of the Grenfell project. Is that right?
Yeah, not like I am now.
Had you looked at it at all at the time of the Grenfell
I
project?
think I'd probably been sent parts of it by consultants and manufacturers, but generally just to pass on.
Had you ever read it, sat down and read any bits of it yourself?
Not that I remember, no.
Did you know what the purpose was of this kind of practical guidance?
Not at that time in my career, no. I mean, now I can look back on it and say that it is the same as Eurocodes. It's a way of satisfying the building regulations, but at the time my focus was structural engineering, so I wouldn't have known that that was doing the same thing as the Eurocodes.
Yeah. Can we turn on to page 93 where we see B4, functional requirement B4 of Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations. Do you see that there?
Yes.
B4.1, the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. I just summarised that for you earlier and asked you if you're familiar with it. I think you said no. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then if we turn on to page 95 of this, at paragraph 12.5, there's a section beginning external wall construction at the bottom of that page. We can just zoom in on that. Yeah. So here there's a warning. It says this: the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it is likely to be a risk to health or safety. the use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were you aware of that warning at the time of the Grenfell project?
No.
Were you aware, in general terms, that the use of combustible materials and extensive cavities may present a risk in tall buildings?
I was aware that it was something that people were cautious of and needed to be run by the consultants to make sure that whatever was being used complied.
I see. Now, in the next paragraph, under 12.5, it says this: external walls should either meet the guidance given in paragraphs 12.6 to 12.9 or meet the performance criteria given in the BRE report, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls, BR 135, for cladding systems using full-scale test data from BS 8414. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time that there was guidance suggesting that external walls should either meet the guidance given in this document or meet the performance criteria in BR 135 with test data from 8414 testing?
I was aware that there was performance criteria that the fire consultants worked to, but I wouldn't have been able to say what it was.
And you weren't aware of the difference between following this guidance and having had a test carried out on a cladding system?
No, I wasn't.
So is it right that you can't tell us that when Harley was doing its design work on the facade, you can't tell us whether anyone was following the guidance in 12.6 to 12.9 or meeting the performance criteria in BR 135?
I would have thought that we'd be trying to follow something and then passing it back to see if it complied, because I don't know. I certainly didn't know whether it complied or not.
Yeah. When you say I'd have thought we were following something or trying to follow something, can you give us any indication of what Harley might have been trying to follow in its design work?
From past projects, we'd always followed what had been put in the prescriptive design, and then that had been signed off by the fire consultants. So we probably would have been following that same approach of taking the initial design, following it, and then expecting it to be signed off by a fire consultant.
Okay. Were you aware that in this guidance document there was special guidance around buildings above 18 metres?
I knew that there was something special about buildings above 18 metres. There was a different criteria that had to be met, but I wouldn't have been able to say what that criteria was.
Can we look at paragraph 12.6 that's at the bottom of that page there? We've got a heading external surfaces. Do you see that there?
Yep.
And it says there, 12.6, the external surfaces of walls should meet the provisions in diagram 40. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And if we can look at diagram 40, which is on page 97, was that a diagram that you had ever seen at the time you were working on the Grenfell project?
Yes, I think suppliers had sent it to us before, but
Did you know yourself how to interpret that in terms of the guidance it was giving?
no.
Did you know that for Grenfell it would be the bottom right-hand sketch there, E, any building, which would be applicable?
I can't remember, but logically it looks like the right one.
Now, diagram 40 required something called National Class 0 or European Class B, S3, D2 or better. We'll come back to National Class 0 later, but the Class B, S3, D2, did you understand that at the time of the Grenfell project?
No, until I did the degree with Bath, I wasn't aware of the European classifications at all.
Yeah. And so you wouldn't have known what the S3D2 meant either?
Not at that point, no.
No. Now, if we go on page 96 and we look at paragraph 12.7, it states there, in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation project, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were you aware of that guidance more generally at the time you were working on the Grenfell project?
No.
Had you ever heard of the phrase limited combustibility?
Yes, I had. I thought it was just same as like class 0 or 1, that it meant it didn't burn very much.
So did you appreciate that within this guidance document there was a specific definition of limited combustibility and what tests had to be undergone to meet that phrase?
No, I didn't.
So does it follow that you weren't aware that this guidance required the insulation product to be of limited combustibility?
No, not at that point, because I was responsible for the structural design, wasn't educated in this.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of other specialist guidance documents, industry guidance at the time, had you heard of the Building Control Alliance, the BCA?
I think that, yeah, I'd heard of it as the BCA. I didn't know it stood for Building Control Alliance.
Were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project that the BCA issued guidance documents for the construction industry?
Looking back on it now, I can remember people talking about technical notes, but I didn't know who they were issued by. Now I can connect the two together.
If we can just look at, this is a piece of BCA guidance, CEP 30579294. And this is Technical Guidance Note 18, Use of Combustible Cladding Materials on Residential Buildings, dated June 2014. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, at the time of the Grenfell project, were you familiar with this document?
Looking back on it, I can remember people telling me that they'd had desktop studies done for things, and on other projects we sent desktop studies off to the fire consultants to be cross-checked and approved or rejected. But it's only looking back on it now that I know that came from this document.
Did you read this document, do you think, at the time of the Grenfell project?
I don't believe so.
Now, we can see that you were sent this version of the BCA guidance on the 8th of April 2015 by Jonathan Room at Celotex. If we could just pull that up. This is at CEL 403628. And again, I'll come back to this email later when we're talking about Celotex in more detail. But what I want to note here is that if you look at the third paragraph of this email to you on the 8th of April 2015, he says, I've attached the building control guidance notes for insulation products above 18 metres, which seem to be doing the rounds at the moment. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And there was an attachment to this email, which was the guidance note I was just showing you. Can you remember what you did with that guidance when it was sent to you by Mr. Room?
No, I can't.
Do you recall whether you passed it on to any other Harley employees?
No, I can't.
Or Kevin Lamb?
No.
Or to Studio E?
No.
Or Ryden?
No.
Just to be clear, you weren't familiar with it before this point, is that right?
No, I wasn't familiar with it. I can remember just that people used to talk about the desktop studies as a way of getting something approved, and that we send them on.
Yeah. Can we go back to that technical note 18, CEP 30579294? It tells us in the first paragraph under purpose that the technical guidance notes are for the benefit of its members and the construction industry, to provide information, promote good practice, and encourage consistency of interpretation for the benefit of our clients. Do you see that there?
Yes.
They are advisory in nature, and in all cases, the responsibility for determining compliance with the building regulations remains with the building control body concerned. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, if we then go down in this document under introduction, it says there, section 12 of approved document B2 gives guidance on the acceptable use of combustible materials within the external cladding system. And it says, where a building exceeds 18 metres in height, ADB2 recommends for the entire wall area both below and above 18 metres, either the use of materials of limited combustibility for all key components, or to submit evidence that the complete proposed external cladding system has been assessed according to the acceptance criteria in BR 135. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, again, were you aware that there was guidance from the building control body, this building control body, the Building Control Alliance, along those lines about using materials of limited combustibility for all key components, or submitting evidence that the proposed external system has been assessed according to BR 135? Were you aware of that at the time?
No.
So did you ever give any consideration to what materials of limited combustibility for all key components meant?
No, I'd never read this, so I didn't.
So even though you're sent it by a representative of Celotex, you wouldn't have thought to read this?
I think we were getting a lot of pressure from Celotex and a lot of sales material at that time. I can't remember reading it.
Now, under key issues, immediately below that, this guidance says, if we read from the first bit, fire spread via the external wall medium is exacerbated by the use of combustible materials and extensive cavities. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And that mirrors what we saw before in 12.5, do you remember, of ADB, where it was highlighting the same risks. Do you recall that just a minute ago? And the guidance goes on. The speed by which a flame rises vertically up the external face of a building leads to potentially rapid fire spread from lower floors to higher ones. Within the confines of a cavity, the flame will also elongate up to 10 times its length as it searches for oxygen. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were those risks that you were generally aware of at the time of the Grenfell project?
I don't think to this extent. I think at the time my understanding was just that you could get unseen spread of flame, so not that it would spread so high or so quickly.
Yeah.
And then that's why you had to put in cavity barriers.
Yeah.
To stop the unseen spread of fire.
Yeah. So it goes on, hence the need for robust cavity barriers, restricted combustibility of key components, and the use of materials with a low spread of flame rating is necessary, and then particularly given the delamination and spalling nature of some of the components when heated. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Again, were you aware of all of that in general terms at the time of the Grenfell project?
Not of the delamination, spalling. No, and
Yeah.
the combustibility part I would have thought would have been assessed before, being sent out on a particular project.
Yeah.
So when we received the materials to be used on a project, I would have assumed that this work had been checked previously.
Yeah. Now, a little further down, if we pick up in the third paragraph there under key issues, it says there, a surface spread of flame classification does not infer any resistance to combustibility. It is solely a measure of the spread of flame across the surface. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, did you understand that at the time you were working on the Grenfell project?
No, that wasn't something that was, as far as I'm aware, I wasn't made aware of that until I went to university.
Did you understand that surface spread of flame classifications might be referring to Class Naught or National Class Naught?
I just understood that Class Naught meant that it wouldn't catch fire.
Okay. And then there's some bullet points under that paragraph, and it says this: thermosetting insulants, rigid polyurethane foam boards, do not meet the limited combustibility requirements of ADB Table A7, and so should not be accepted as meeting ADB 2, paragraph 12.7. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Again, were you aware at the time of the project that thermosetting insulants didn't meet the limited combustibility requirements and so should not be accepted as meeting parts of the ADB guidance?
No, I just wasn't looking at this kind of thing. I was focused on fabrication and structural design.
Were you aware that thermosetting insulants such as PIR, polyisocyanurate foam, or phenolic foam were not of limited combustibility and therefore were only compliant if included as part of a cladding system tested to BR135 and 8414?
No, I wasn't, for the same reasons mentioned before.
Did you ever apply your mind to whether the insulation at Grenfell Tower was of limited combustibility?
No.
Did you ever seek any assurances that the insulation was of limited combustibility?
No.
Did you ever apply your mind to whether the insulation at Grenfell Tower had been tested to BR135 and BS8414?
I don't remember. No.
Were you aware that any such testing referred to the complete assembly and it referred to system testing as opposed to the testing of one component?
No.
And finally, under this same section, there's a bullet point there right at the very bottom. It says the BR135 BS8414 test deals solely with the spread of fire once it has entered the cavity. Hence, the requirements for cavity barriers in accordance with Section 9 of ADB2 are required in all cases, including around openings in the facade. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware that there was industry guidance at this time which specifically drew attention to the importance of including cavity barriers around openings in the facade?
No, I wasn't. I was aware that you needed cavity barriers, and on other projects that we've been involved with, we drew elevations that showed where we were intending to put the cavity barriers, and they'd be sent off to the consultant for them to approve or add additional ones where they thought they were necessary.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that would be an appropriate moment for a break. Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Anketell-Jones, we'll have a break now. We'll take about a quarter of an hour. We'll come back at 25 to 4. While you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it.
Yes,
All right?
sir.
If you'd like to go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, 25 to 4, please.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes. Would you ask the witness to come back in, please? Thank you. Right. Ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
That's right. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Anketell-Jones. So we were looking, before we broke, at the Building Control Alliance guidance from June 2014 that you were sent in April 2015 by Mr. Room. Yes. And I want to go back to that and look at page 2 of it. So this is CEP 57294 and look at page 2. And we can see here that what it does is set out different options, 3 routes to compliance with paragraph 12.7 of ADB. We have option 1, option 2, and then at the bottom of the page, option 3. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project that there were, in general terms, these different options for complying with the guidance to the building regulations?
I think the only one that I was aware of was the desktop studies, by the fact that we'd submitted others on other projects to the fire consultants for approval.
And were you aware of what that desktop study report was showing? What was that trying to demonstrate?
It was demonstrating that it was compliant by using fire engineering rather than testing.
I see. So option 1 was to use materials of limited combustibility for all elements of the cladding system above and below 18 metres. You see that there?
Yes.
Option 2 was an acceptable alternative approach is to submit evidence that the complete proposed external cladding system has been assessed according to the BR 135 criteria by 8414 testing. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then option 3 is the desktop study report from a suitably independent UCAS accredited body, stating whether, in their opinion, the BR 135 criteria would be met with the proposed system. Do you see that there?
Yes.
In general terms, were you aware of the distinction between system testing and the other route, which was about individual products being, for example, of limited combustibility? Were you aware of that distinction?
No.
In respect of option 2, did you ever make any investigations as to whether a specific BS 8414 test had been done using the system specified for Grenfell?
No, because I wasn't involved in that part. I was involved in the structural design.
In respect of option 3, did you or anyone else make any investigations as to whether a desktop study had been undertaken on the system that had been specified for Grenfell?
Not as far as I'm aware.
So you're not aware of any desktop study being commissioned in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
No.
Do you recall taking any steps yourself to ensure that the system at Grenfell Tower satisfied one of these 3 options for demonstrating compliance?
No, because my responsibility was to do the structural design.
Whose responsibility was it within Harley to ensure that the cladding system satisfied one of these options for compliance?
At that time, as we had no technical manager, it would have fallen to the senior designer, to the senior management.
So who would that have been at the time in Harley?
Would have been the directors, which would have been Mark Stapley and Ray Bailey and Mark Harris.
Do you have a recollection of them actually considering the compliance of the Grenfell Tower system with relevant guidance at the time? Do you remember them doing that?
No.
Did you ever raise the question of what route to compliance you were adopting with anyone at Harley?
No, because I was just looking at structural design.
Or anyone else on the project, Studio E or Ryden?
No.
Can we look at your first main witness statement at paragraph 33? This is HAR 30100149 at page 8. Paragraph 33. You say there, the version of Building Control Alliance's BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 available at the time, June 2014 version, was also misleading and offered a way of circumnavigating the requirement of paragraph 12.7 of approved document B through option 3. This third option allowed a desktop study to be carried out. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Can you just explain to us in what way this Technical Guidance Note 18 was misleading, in your view?
I just, from my knowledge now, I see it as open to interpretation. You'd get different fire consultants comparing results from other tests and making different conclusions from that. And to me, that isn't clear enough. If two fire consultants can come up with different opinions, it's not clear. It must be misleading.
You started that answer by saying, from my knowledge now. Does that mean that at the time of the Grenfell project, you didn't consider this guidance misleading?
No, I didn't know about this guidance at that point.
And you talk about it offered a way of circumnavigating the requirement of paragraph 12.7 of approved document B. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project of a culture of professionals circumnavigating some of the guidance in the approved documents?
No.
So what direct experience do you have of that? You say offered a way of circumnavigating the requirement of paragraph 12.7. Do you say that you do have direct experience of that?
Since leaving Harley, I've got experience of different manufacturers trying to put forward products that they say they have desktop studies for, but they've quite often not been carried out by a UCAS body. And when they have been put forward to the fire consultants, they've been rejected.
I see. But just to be clear, that wasn't something you were aware of at the time of the Grenfell project?
No.
So this was we were just looking at the June 2014 version of the BCA guidance. I'd just now like to take you to a later edition of that same guidance from June 2015. This is at CEL 402347. Now, do you have any recollection of reading this further version of the guidance at the time you were involved in the Grenfell project?
No.
Now, on page 1, what we can see under key issues, if we go down that page and look at the bottom half of that page, in the third paragraph under key issues, we see the same sentence about a surface spread of claim classification not referring any resistance to combustibility. And then in the first bullet point, it talks about thermosetting insulants not usually meeting the limited combustibility requirements, but it gives more examples in the part in parenthesis, in brackets, in that first line. Do you see there it says, e.g. rigid polyurethane, polyisocyanurate, polystyrene foam boards. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I want to ask you, I know you said you didn't read this guidance, but were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project that insulants such as polyisocyanurate, PIR, didn't meet certain requirements of ADB?
No, I wasn't.
And were you aware that they should only be accepted as meeting paragraph 12.7 of ADB if they were included as part of a cladding system tested to BR135 and BS8414?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of polyisocyanurate foam boards at the time of the Grenfell project?
No.
So if you'd been asked to name some manufacturers of PIR boards at the time, you wouldn't have been able to tell us?
I don't believe so, no.
Now, I now want to look at the CWCT. We talked about them briefly, and I think you confirmed that Harley was a member of the CWCT at the time of the Grenfell project. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe so. It was, I think the membership was dealt with by Mark Stapley and Graham Hackley.
Yeah. Now, can we look at a document? This is CEL 409876, and we'll need the offline version to be able to see it clearly. Now, we're going to come back to this in the context of looking more carefully at the insulation, but for now, this is an entry from the Celotex Salesforce database. And it relates, it's not very easy to read, but in the top right, it relates to something called Merit House. And if you look on the right-hand side at the top, we can see related to Merit House, and then underneath it says name, Daniel Anketell-Jones. Can you see that?
Yep.
And under the comments, yes, that's better, thank you. And under the comments, you can see there, it says, met Dan at the CWCT members meeting. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And this appears to be an entry from around October 2014. Well, it says last modified by Mark Willoughby on the 13th of October 2014, I think in the bottom right-hand corner. Do you remember attending a CWCT members meeting in October 2014?
I don't remember.
Do you ever remember meeting a representative of Celotex at a CWCT members meeting?
No, I don't remember.
Can you help us as to what occurred at the members meetings?
We used to go to talks. I can't remember if they were CWCT or by other either product suppliers or just sort of general talks, but I wouldn't know what this one was about.
Were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project that Harley had access to the benefits of CWCT membership, including updates on technical training, publications and certification work?
I think until I sort of was asked to consider training into the technical role, I was primarily concerned with structural issues, so I don't remember much about the CWCT at that point.
I see, but you wouldn't have been talking to representatives of Celotex about structural issues, would you?
No.
No. Do you have any recollection of speaking to representatives of Celotex at CWCT members' meetings?
No, I don't.
Were you personally aware at this time that there were guidance notes produced by the CWCT?
I can't honestly remember at what point I became aware of them.
Let's have a look at a document. This is CWCT 5019. So this is a document that we know was produced in March 2011, and it's entitled Technical Note 73, Fire Performance of Curtain Walls and Rain Screens. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, is this familiar to you? Had you seen this by the time you worked on the Grenfell project?
It's familiar to me now. I can't remember when it would have become familiar to me. I think that because I was primarily focused on structural stuff before becoming, being put forward for doing the MSc, I think it wouldn't have been until sort of the end of 2015 or something before I started appreciating that these documents existed.
Right. Now, if we look at the top of the... if we look at the bottom of page 1 and over to page 2, this guidance begins to draw attention to different descriptions and classifications of materials under the building regulations. If we can go right down to the bottom of this page. Can we do that? It's the text. I can see it peeping out at the bottom. It's text beginning in England and Wales and Northern Ireland on the bottom right-hand side of this page. That's the bit I want to look at. There we go. So it begins here. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, materials may be described as non-combustible. And then if we go over the page to the top of the next page, page 2, so materials may be described as non-combustible, of limited combustibility, or class 0, using definitions given in ADB. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then it says materials may also be classified as class 1, 2, 3, or 4 in accordance with BS 476 parts 6 and 7. And then it says equivalent European classifications are also used. Did you have any understanding at the time of the Grenfell project of the difference between non-combustible, limited combustibility, and class 0 materials?
No, I didn't.
Were you aware of a distinction between class 0 and limited combustibility?
No.
Now, can we look at paragraph 27 of your witness statement at this point? This is HAR 3010149 at page 6. So you say this: at the time of the refurbishment, the main source of guidance was and still is approved document B, which is a document produced by the government. The requirement under approved document B is that the external surfaces of materials used on a building over, and then if we go over the page, 18 metres are class 0, and therefore the relevant British standard would be BS 476. Also, any insulation product used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. Now, do you see that there?
Yes.
So that's the evidence you're giving us in your witness statement. Can we just go back a page and see what question you're answering there? So we're asking you, was the exterior compliant with relevant building regulations, fire regulations, etc.? Do we take it from that what you're telling us is what you know now and not what you knew at the time of the project?
Yeah, this was from learning it on the fire and acoustics course that you mentioned before, and also having actually used that knowledge since in practice.
And do you agree with me that you don't tell us in your witness statement that you didn't know that at the time?
No.
Can we look at paragraph 28, which follows this paragraph of your witness statement? So over onto page 7. So you say there, in terms of industry practice, at the time it was generally considered that as long as all of the components, in particular the cladding and insulation, were described as class 0 in manufacturers' literature and third-party certifications, then this met the requirements of approved document B and was therefore compliant. There are many buildings across the UK that have been clad in exactly the same way as the government's own figures. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, you're saying there that that was industry practice at the time. You say that in the first line. Was that your understanding at the time of the Grenfell project?
No, it wasn't my understanding at the time. I was focused on structural design and fabrication detailing. This is my take on it, having spoken to other people in the industry and seen what has been put on buildings, in the last 10 years.
I thought you told us earlier today that you were aware of Class Naught at the time.
Yeah, I was aware of Class Naught. It was just not in this arrangement. So, because here I'm saying that of what the industry practice was, but it's looking backwards.
Yeah. But was it your understanding at the time that as long as all of the components were described as Class Naught in manufacturer's literature and third-party certifications, then this met the requirement of approved document B and was compliant? Was that your understanding at the time?
I don't think I had an understanding at the time. I think because I was focused on structural design and fabrication design, I always deferred to the fire consultant for advice.
Are you saying that you never applied your mind at all through the Grenfell project to what the classification was of, for example, the insulation?
No, because I wasn't looking at the insulation. I was looking at the structural design of the bracketry and the systems that held it on.
So you never thought about that at all?
No.
Okay. So when you talk about industry practice at the time, who exactly are you referring to there? Are you talking about cladding subcontractors, architects, fire engineers, building control? Can you help us as to what you mean by that?
I'm talking about the whole building industry.
Does that mean it incorporates all of the bodies I was just mentioning?
Yes.
So cladding subcontractors thought that at the time.
Yes.
Architects thought that at the time.
Yeah. I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah. And did you or anyone else at Harley ever challenge that industry practice? Do you remember anyone saying, well, actually, Class Naught's not enough for the components. We need to look deeper than that?
I'm not aware of anyone at Harley doing that, no.
Now, if we return to that CWCT technical note on page 2, so this is CWCT 5019 at page 2, it goes on that left-hand column, if we look at the bottom of the page, please, under definitions, it gives definitions of a fire stop there, a seal provided to close an imperfection of fit or design tolerance between elements or components to restrict the passage of fire and smoke. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then it talks about the difference between integrity and insulation. And then at the top of the next column, if we can bring the top of the page up on the right, then we get the definition of a cavity barrier, a construction to close a concealed space against the penetration or spread of smoke or flame. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were you aware at the time of working on the Grenfell project that there was a distinction drawn in industry guidance and other practical guidance between fire stopping and cavity barriers?
I think at that time I was just aware of fire breaks, which encompassed both of them, and that you'd need to put different ones on depending on what you were told by the fire consultant.
So if I'd asked you at the time, do you know what the difference is between a fire stop and a cavity barrier, what would you have said?
I wouldn't have known the difference between the two.
Now, moving on to page 4 of this guidance, under the heading Cavity Barriers in Rain Screen Construction, which is in the bottom right-hand column. There we go. So there's a paragraph that reads, fire and smoke spread in rain screen cavities is particularly dangerous as it may be more rapid than on the outside face of the cladding due to the creation of a flue, and it may be undetected by building users or firefighters. It is therefore often necessary to incorporate cavity barriers in rain screen cavities to limit the spread of fire and smoke. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time that fire and smoke spread in rain screen cavities is particularly dangerous?
I was aware that it could spread behind rain screen, and I thought that it just needed to be stopped so that the firefighters could tackle the actual fire.
What was your understanding as to the role of cavity barriers within a rain screen cavity?
To stop that spread of fire where it could go without the firemen being able to see where it would go.
And was that within the cavity itself and the outside wall, or were you also aware that cavity barriers were required to stop the fire breaking out and into the rain screen cavity?
I was aware that they were required. I think from other projects, we'd basically, like I said before, we'd created elevations showing where they were going to go, and the fire consultant would usually draw on where you needed additional ones.
Yeah.
I didn't understand where they were required.
Yeah. Now, this note goes on to say, under regulations, there we have it at the bottom of page 4, for rain screen walls, ADB requires that cavity barriers are provided. And then if we go over to page 5, we see there a bullet point at the top that says to close the edges of cavities, including around window openings. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time that there was specific industry guidance that emphasised the importance of closing the edges of cavity barriers, the edges of cavities, including around window openings?
No.
Did you know, in general terms, that window openings had to be protected in terms of the spread of fire on your projects?
No.
And then we can see at page 6, if we go to page 6 and look under the heading use of combustible material on that left-hand column, we see in the second paragraph it says to satisfy the recommendations in ADB, insulation and filler materials in walls of a building with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level are required to be of limited combustibility. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And just to be clear, you weren't aware of that guidance at the time of the Grenfell project, is that right?
No, because I was focused on structural design, and these things I would always pass on to the fire consultant because I wasn't trained in it.
Right. And the guidance further down that column, if we look at the bottom of that page. Yeah, so if we look at the paragraph that's just above the heading alternative approaches, it says there the only commonly used insulation material that will satisfy the definition of limited combustibility is mineral wool. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Again, were you aware at the time of the Grenfell project that the only commonly used insulation which satisfied the definition of limited combustibility was mineral wool?
No.
Were you aware in general terms that mineral wool was the safest type of insulation to use in terms of fire performance?
I can remember at the time there was lots of talk about other insulations, but I wasn't aware that, and that they weren't approved for over 18 metres, but I didn't realise that mineral wool was the only one that was.
So you remember at the time there was lots of talk about other insulations and that they weren't approved for over 18 metres. Can you remember what kind of insulations you're talking about there?
No, I just remember that it was always something that you needed to get signed off by the fire consultant.
I see. Now, can I ask you to look again at at page 6 of this guidance, and at the bottom is the heading alternative approaches, and then at the top of the right-hand column, if we go back to the top of the page, so it's under that heading, it says this: where testing is carried out in accordance with BS 8414, the test applies to the complete cladding system, including insulation, rain screen flashings and cavity barriers. Changing any of these components may affect the ability of the wall to resist the spread of fire. Now, is that something that you were generally aware of at the time?
No, I wasn't aware that you had to do I wasn't aware of that.
So you weren't aware that the test would apply only to the complete system, including all those details that were tested, and that changing any of that system might affect the ability of the wall to resist the spread of fire. You were not aware of that?
I don't think I was even aware there was a test. On other projects, I would always just submit the drawings and the material data sheets to the fire consultant for approval.
But we looked earlier, and we'll come back to it again, at the email you sent to Mr. Room in 2015, where you're asking about the BS 8414 test.
Yeah,
So when you say I wasn't aware there was even a test, can you explain that?
It was just something so outside of what I did in structural engineering that if it was requested by a client or fire consultant, you pretty much copy and pasted what they were asking for because they knew what they were asking for.
So you weren't aware, even in general terms, that there was something that was a system test for fire?
It's hard to separate out what I know now, having done the degree and practiced it, between what I knew then.
Okay. Can we look at paragraph 30 of your witness statement? This is HAR 3010149 at page 7. Thank you. And you state there, so you're asked the question, to the extent that it was compliant with such regulations, legislation, British standards, guidance, etc., were any of those inadequate, and if so, in what respects, so far as relevant to the nature and immediate causes of the fire and its spread? And then you say this, with hindsight, I believe that the guidance and the legislation is absolutely not adequate. As far as I'm aware, there was no guidance from any official bodies, such as the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology, CWCT, and the Society of Facade Engineers, that these materials should be avoided. It is still impossible for either the CWCT or the SFE to offer any guidance, as the government has still not made the necessary changes. Now, focusing on that first part, you say, as far as I'm aware, there was no guidance from any official bodies such as the CWCT. But do you agree, given what we've just looked at, that guidance was available from the CWCT regarding the risks associated with combustible materials, including PIR, polyisocyanurate insulation?
Yeah, what I mean is that they just should not be allowed. Anything, with a B rating or worse should not be allowed over 18 metres.
They should have been banned, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
But would you agree with me that there was guidance warning about the risks associated with combustible material, including PIR insulation?
I just don't think it was, looking back on it now, I don't believe it was strong enough. I think the guidance, allowed for a way to, for it to be signed off or approved. And I just don't, looking at it now with the experience that I have and the education I have, I don't think that it should be put on buildings.
But just to be clear, I think you've said you didn't read the CWCT guidance from March 2011, is that correct?
Back then, no, I hadn't read it.
And you didn't read the Building Control Alliance guidance in June 14 or June 15?
No.
Can you help us as to why you weren't aware of that CWCT guidance when Harley was a member of the CWCT?
For me, I was looking at structural design and not facade design, so I wouldn't have been sent these sort of things. They weren't circulated as far as I'm aware. They would have come into Graham Hackley or Mark Stapley.
We'll see later, and I'll take you through it in detail, that you had a lot of dealings with Celotex during the project. Why were you having those dealings with Celotex if none of this was part of your remit and it was all Mark Stapley and Graham Hackley's remit?
Because in the Celotex's rep's previous role, he'd been dealing with me on structural issues with the company that he'd worked with before, and we'd formed a relationship. So he used to come in and sit down and talk about things, but generally I didn't have the background or the training to talk about fire-related matters or anything else to do with facade engineering apart from the structural side at that point. So, as with the other things, I'd pass anything that I didn't know about through to, the relevant consultants who did.
Graham Hackley had left Harley by the time of the Grenfell project, hadn't he?
Yep.
So in terms of Mark Stapley, we aren't aware of any communications where you say to Mark Stapley, I don't have this experience, I don't have this expertise on fire, please can you help me? We don't see that, do we, in your email communications?
No.
Do you recall ever sending such emails to Mr. Stapley?
No, but they were fully aware of what my area of expertise were.
I see. Now, I want to ask you briefly about Harley's contractual duties on the Grenfell Tower project. Just briefly, did you yourself read the letter of intent and appendices that were sent to Harley by Ryden and which formed part of the relationship between the two companies?
No.
As design manager, was it important for you to understand the nature of your contractual responsibilities to ensure that Harley's work complied with them?
My responsibilities as design manager were to make sure that the designers were working to programme. And so the parts that would have been relevant would have been the programme. I wouldn't have read the contract.
Did you understand that Harley was responsible for ensuring that the design of the facade was compliant with the relevant compliances and statutory requirements, which would include the building regulations?
No, I didn't.
Does that mean you positively thought it was somebody else's responsibility, not Harley's, to be ensuring compliance of the facade design with the building regulations?
I think my understanding at the time on all projects was that it wasn't Harley's responsibility, that you put forward your designs to the design team and building control who would check it and confirm whether it was compliant or not.
Did you ever check that assumption with anybody? Did you ever say, can I just check, are we responsible for making sure this complies with the building regulations?
Never checked that, but I did on other projects that I worked on, I would check that it had been approved.
Were you aware that some of the subcontract conditions that were imposed in the contract with Ryden required Harley to notify Ryden if there were any discrepancies between the design of the work shown in the employer's requirements and the statutory requirements, including in the building regulations?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Were you aware that as the specialist subcontractor, you ought to warn either the main contractor or the lead designer, Studio E, if there was a deficiency in the design in terms of compliance with the building regulations?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Were you aware that it was part of Harley's role to check whether the products that had been proposed in the employer's requirements, including the NBS specification, were compliant with the building regulations and associated guidance?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Were you ever made aware of any concerns at the time being raised about whether the design was compliant with the relevant regulatory requirements, including the building regulations?
No, I wasn't.
Did you understand that the conditions that were imposed by Ryden on Harley included a liability for design work to the standard of an architect or other appropriate professional designer holding themselves out as competent to do the work?
Sorry, I don't understand
Yeah,
the
sorry, it was a
question.
long question. Did you understand that the conditions that were imposed by Ryden on Harley included a liability for design work to the standard of an architect or other appropriate professional designer holding themselves out as competent to do the work?
Sorry, can you summarise that in a way that I literally...
Were you aware that Harley's work had to meet the standard of an architect's work in terms of the facade design?
No, I wasn't.
Or had to meet the standard of another appropriate professional designer holding themselves out as competent to do the facade design?
No.
Did you understand that the provisions of the main contract between the TMO and Ryden were incorporated into Harley's subcontract insofar as they related to the design of the facade?
No.
Did you understand that the intention of the subcontract was that Harley should take on the design responsibilities in relation to the external cladding works that Ryden had undertaken to the TMO under the design and build contract?
Sorry, that's another long one.
Yeah, sorry. Did you understand that the intention of the subcontract was that Harley would take on the design responsibilities in relation to the external cladding work that Ryden had undertaken to the TMO? So, in effect, did you understand that you were sitting in Ryden's shoes so far as it concerned the design of the cladding and the external wall?
No.
Did you ever take the opportunity to inspect the main Ryden building contract?
No.
Now, we know that this was a JCT design and build contract. That was the Ryden's contract, was design and build. How familiar were you with design and build projects?
From a contracts point of view, or in
From
general?
projects point of view, how many of the projects you've been involved in
I think,
were design and build?
for my part, I never had any dealings with contract at all, and so probably at that point in my career wouldn't have been aware of what contracts were design and build or weren't design and build.
You wouldn't have been aware of what was meant by design and build?
I don't think so, no.
Did you understand at the time you were working for Harley on the project that the architect and other design consultants were not retained by the TMO through to completion of the construction and handover of the building?
No.
Did you understand that Ryden had taken on responsibility for the entire design and construction of the works?
No.
Did you understand that because Ryden would not have itself expertise to design and construct every element of the works, it would appoint specialist subcontractors for particular elements?
No.
And that those subcontractors would be liable for the design and construction of that particular element of the works? Did you understand that?
No.
Were you aware whether Ryden had in place a process to supervise the quality of the work that Harley was doing on the project?
Quality of the install or quality of the design or everything?
Quality of the design, really, is what I'm thinking of.
My understanding at that point would have been that they would pass the information that we sent them through to their design team to approve. And that would have been how they maintained the quality.
I see. So you weren't ever made aware of Ryden independently checking or
No.
looking at the design?
No.
Was it your understanding that Harley's contract required it, or subcontract with Ryden, required it to consider the NBS specification, which had been part of the employer's requirements?
I wouldn't have known that that was in the contract, but I knew that it was on every job we're given a specification. I knew that on this job it was an NBS specification.
We'll come and look at the NBS specification later, but were you aware in general terms that there was something called the NBS specification on this project, the Grenfell project? Yeah. Were you aware that Harley's work had to comply with a specification produced by Curtains Consulting, which was entitled Structural Performance Specification for the Design, Supply and Application of Overcladding Systems to Grenfell Tower?
No, I thought the only one we had to comply with was the NBS specification.
Can we just look at that Curtains Consulting document? This is at ART 50914. So does this help in any way? You didn't think you'd seen this specification. Now you can see this front page. Does that trigger any recollection of seeing this at the time?
No, I can't remember ever seeing this before.
I just want to have a look at a couple of items in here. If we go to section 6 on page 9, we can see that the contractor is expressly required to consider, and then just at the bottom of that page, can you see 3 items up? It says the need for effective fire barriers. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware that that was part of Harley's responsibility to consider the need for effective fire barriers?
We would have known that we needed to put fire barriers in. We just wouldn't have known necessarily where they needed to go. We've relied on the fire consultant to tell us, as with other projects I'd worked on.
And then if we look on at page 11 of this specification, item 7.1.13, we see there it says this: the system should comply fully with the recommendations of the BRE document, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, 2nd edition 2003. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And also it says in the paragraph below that, 7.1.14, the system shall not be a fire risk at any stage of installation, nor shall it constitute a fire hazard after completion if for any reason the insulant becomes exposed. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, looking back at 7.1.13 and that BRE document, were you familiar at the time with that BRE publication, BR 135?
No.
Let's just turn to that. This is at BRE 405554. If we go to page 2, we see the front page of it. This is the 2nd edition of that document. It was dated 2003. And again, just by looking at that, can you recollect whether you ever saw that at the time of the Grenfell project?
No, I only became aware of this document when I went to Bath for the MSc.
So you wouldn't have been aware of any of the guidance in this document about the risks posed by external thermal insulation in walls in multi-storey buildings?
No, I wasn't taught it until I'd left the company.
Can we just look at a couple of bits of this guidance? Mr. Chairman, I'd quite like just to finish this topic, if that's okay. I can do that within the next 5 minutes.
Well, if you can do it in 5 minutes, of course.
Thank you. So on page 7, there's reference to and a picture from the Garnet Court fire in Irvine, which is a fire in a multi-storey building. You can see there's a discussion of that there, and then there's a picture below that. Do you ever remember seeing anything about the Garnet Court fire in Irvine at the time of the Grenfell project?
No, I don't.
Can I look at pages 17 and 18? Under the heading at the bottom of 17, external panel, non-combustible materials and materials of limited combustibility. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And if we go over to the top of page 18, so if we pick up 3 lines down, so this is talking about metal panels. It says they may also generate large pieces of falling debris if the integrity of the fixings to the railing system is lost during the fire. Metal panels such as aluminium may fall from the system if the strength of the fixings is affected by the local fire source. They may also melt, generating molten metal debris if exposed directly to the sustained flame envelope. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were you aware, you say you didn't see this guidance and you weren't aware of it, were you aware in general terms of those kind of phenomenon in terms of metal panels such as aluminium? Were you aware of this? Melting, generating molten metal debris if exposed directly to the sustained flame envelope. Were you aware of that in general terms?
Yeah, from doing the structural degree, I was aware that aluminium has a much lower melting temperature than steel, and with the temperatures created in a fire, aluminium will melt.
Now, the version of this document that was closest in time to the Grenfell fire is the 2013, the third edition of BR 135. If we can pull this up at CEL 403364. CEL 403364. Again, so there's the front page. It's the third edition. It was dated 2013, and it was by Sarah Colwell and Tony Baker. Does that front page help in terms of whether you saw this version, the third edition, at the time of the Grenfell project?
I recognise it now, but I don't believe I saw it then.
Can we look? I want to have a look at page 22, at just one piece of this at the moment, at paragraph 6.4.1, page 22. The last paragraph. Yes, so it's on the right-hand side there, and it's the paragraph beginning combustible panels are typically, and it's immediately before 6.4.2. And I just want to read that. It says, combustible panels are typically based on vinyl or glass-reinforced plastic. Although various new products are being developed in this area, some of which also contain insulation materials. These products generally have good surface spread of flame characteristics to prevent rapid fire spread across the surface of the system. But once the panels become involved in the fire, they have the potential to generate falling debris, add to the overall fire load, and provide a route for fire to propagate up the outside of the building. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, again, I know you say you didn't see this at the time, but were you aware in general terms that there were various new combustible panel products being developed at this time, some of which contain insulation materials that could have those characteristics in terms of generating falling debris, adding to the fire load and providing a route for fire spread at the outside of the building? Were you aware of that?
No, the only thing I was aware of is that they would melt.
Would you agree with me now, looking at that this paragraph appears to be warning about precisely the kind of products like ACM that are combustible, that might generate falling debris, add to the overall fire load, and lead to the propagation of fire up the external envelope of the building?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that's a good moment.
Well, it's very good timing. Well done. Thank you. Well, Mr. Anketell-Jones, that's enough for one day, I think. We'll break there. I'm going to have, excuse me, I'm going to have to ask you to come back with some more questions tomorrow, please. So we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And please remember what I said to you earlier. Very important that you don't discuss your evidence or anything related to it while you're out of the room. All right?
Yes, sir.
So if you'd like to go with the usher, we'll see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. 10 o'clock
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thank you.